In the autumn of 1958, families across rural China were handing over the one metal pot each household owned. No soldier stood over them to make them do it. None needed to. The pots went into backyard furnaces, millions of them, thrown up in fields and courtyards that year, because the government had promised that enough melted down scrap metal would let China outproduce Britain in steel within 15 years. None of those pots became steel. They became lumps of unusable iron. By 1961, somewhere between 15 and 55 million people were dead. Not from war. No invading army, no foreign shot fired. The estimates most historians accept, 36 million to 45 million, are still higher than the death toll of the First World War. This is the great leap forward. It starts with the promise. It starts in 1957 in a conference hall in Moscow, packed with the world's communist leaders. Mao Zedong had been running China for 8 years by that point. The revolution was won, the Korean War was over, and China was still, in almost every way that mattered, the junior partner to the Soviet Union. Mao sat in that room and listened to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev make a boast. "Give the USSR 15 years," Khrushchev said, "and it would overtake the United States economically." Mao wasn't going to be outpromised, not by Moscow, and not in front of every other communist leader on earth. He made a promise of his own, on the spot. China would overtake Britain, one of the great industrial powers of the 20th century, in steel production. Also within 15 years. No economists were in the room. No study existed of what Chinese mines, factories, or farmland could realistically produce in 15 years, or in any number of years. The promise came anyway. Backed by 8 years, Mao had spent accumulating more personal authority over more people than almost anyone alive. Within months, in speeches and provincial pep rallies, that 15-year target was already being compressed. Some officials were promising results in 3. Nobody in the Chinese government stood up to ask whether any of this was physically possible. A year earlier, the party had launched the anti-rightist campaign, branding roughly 500,000 people rightists for offering exactly the kind of technical pushback that might have stopped what was coming. So when Mao formally raised the national steel target in May of 1958, it went from a little over 5 million tons the year before to nearly 11 million tons, almost double, in a single year. That was the promise. The machine built to try to keep it came next. The theory behind the Great Leap Forward, in one sentence: if enough people were mobilized, sheer human willpower could substitute for machinery, capital, and time. It was an actual governing strategy, not a figure of speech, and it ran on 2 systems working at once. The first was the People's Commune. It started small, an experimental commune set up in April of 1958 in Chaishan, in Henan province, where for the first time private household plots were fully abolished and communal kitchens replaced individual family meals. Within months, that experiment became the template for the entire country. Village by village, private land was folded into massive collective farms. By the end of 1958, roughly 26,000 of these communes had absorbed something close to 99% of China's rural population, call it 120 million households. Private plots and personal tools were gone. In a lot of communes, even a household's own cooking pot no longer belonged to it, because everyone was expected to eat in communal mess halls, working for work points instead of wages. The second system was steel, and this is where the cooking pots come back in. Mao wanted his target hit, and he wanted ordinary people, not just state factories, to hit it. So villages across the country built what became known as backyard furnaces. Crude, homemade smelters thrown up wherever there was space, fed with whatever scrap metal a household could produce, from old farm tools and door hinges to cooking pots. Tens of millions of farmers were pulled off their fields to tend them. Most of what came out the other end wasn't steel at all. It was brittle, low-grade pig iron, unusable for almost anything. By some estimates, it cost roughly twice as much to produce a ton of this backyard iron as it did to produce a ton of the real thing in an actual factory. Whole hillsides were stripped of trees to keep the furnaces fed with fuel. China spent a season melting down millions of working farm tools to manufacture scrap. While the labor force stood around furnaces instead of working fields, the government was also rewriting how farming itself was supposed to work, based on the theories of a discredited Soviet agronomist named Trofim Lysenko, folded into an official document called the 8-Point Charter of Agriculture. Two techniques got pushed hardest: close planting, seeding crops up to 10 times denser than normal, on the theory that plants of the same species were friendly and wouldn't compete with each other. Deep plowing, turning the soil over more than a meter down, supposedly to reach richer earth underneath. Both were wrong. Close planting meant crops choked each other out, fighting for light and water. Deep plowing buried fertile topsoil under dead, nutrient-poor subsoil and wrecked the fields for seasons to come. State media ran photographs of wheat fields grown so dense, it was claimed, that a child could stand on top of the crop without sinking. There were stories of prize pumpkins weighing well over 100 pounds, paraded through communes on trucks. Some communes, believing the surplus was real, reportedly held eating contests. By the end of 1958, on paper, it was a triumph. Harvests were up, steel output was climbing, and communism seemed to be arriving ahead of schedule. In the fields, it was already a different story. In July of 1959, one man became the first person with any real standing to say so to Mao directly. His name was Peng Dehuai, Minister of National Defense, a decorated general who had commanded Chinese forces through the Korean War, and about as close to untouchable as anyone in China could be without being Mao himself. In July of 1959, the top ranks of the Communist Party gathered at a mountain resort called Lushan to review how the Great Leap was actually going. Peng had just come back from touring the countryside himself, and what he'd seen worried him enough to act. He didn't organize opposition, and he didn't leak anything to a foreign reporter. There was no free press in Mao's China to leak to. Instead, he wrote a private letter, careful and deliberately tactful in tone, addressed to Mao alone, raising concerns about wildly inflated harvest reports and production targets that had never been grounded in reality to begin with. Mao didn't read it quietly and adjust course. He circulated Peng's private letter to the entire conference and turned the room into a loyalty test for the Great Leap Forward, or for Peng Dehuai. There wasn't a third option on the table. Within days, Peng was denounced as the ringleader of an anti-party clique. He was stripped of his post. 3 colleagues who'd voiced agreement with him were purged alongside him. What began at Lushan spread quickly. It became a nationwide campaign called the Anti-Right Deviation Struggle, hunting down anyone in the party who'd expressed similar doubts, down to the county level. Years later, during the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards dragged Peng Dehuai out of obscurity and persecuted him until it killed him. Word of what happened to him moved through the entire party apparatus within weeks. For the next 2 years, While conditions on the ground went from bad to catastrophic, local officials kept reporting record harvests to Beijing. That's the version of events Beijing was receiving. On paper, local officials reported bumper crops, in some regions more than double the real output. On the ground, real grain production was already falling, down an estimated 15% in 1959, and closer to 30% the year after that. The state kept taking its usual cut of the harvest, sometimes more. Procurement quotas were set against the fictional totals, not the real ones, which meant the government was claiming a bigger share of a supply that was actually shrinking fast. In 1959, the first full year of the famine, China's grain exports hit an all-time high, more than 4 million tons, sent abroad in part to repay Soviet debt and in part to keep up appearances as a rising power. Economists who've gone back through the trade data since have estimated that the grain China exported between 1958 and 1960 alone contained enough calories to have fed somewhere between 17 and 39 million people for 3 full years. The worst single documented episode played out in a prefecture in Henan province called Xinjiang. It wasn't a poor region. It produced grain, cotton, and tea. In 1959, local officials there reported a harvest more than double what the land had actually produced, then requisitioned grain against that fictional number, leaving almost nothing behind for the people who'd grown it. Over roughly 6 months, from the winter of 1959 into the spring of 1960, an estimated 1 million people died there, close to 1 in every 8 residents of the entire prefecture. When investigators were eventually sent in and began documenting what they found, some of what went into their internal reports was reportedly considered too extreme to pass any further up the chain. When word of the scale of it finally reached Mao, his first move wasn't to question the policy. It was to blame the disaster on infiltration by class enemies. How many people this killed, nationwide, is something nobody knows for certain, and the argument over the number is still active today, decades later. China's own government has never released a full accounting. The figure closest to an official position sits somewhere around 15 to 20 million. Independent historians working from provincial party archives that were briefly, partially open to researchers in the 2000s arrived at far higher numbers. Frank Decoder, whose book on the famine won the Bailey Gifford Prize, put the total at least at 45 million. Yang Jisheng, a Chinese journalist whose own father starved to death in 1959, arrived at 36 million. A small group of Chinese academics, most prominently a mathematician named Sun Jingxian, have published their own analyses arguing the true toll is dramatically lower than any of that, in the low millions, attributing the higher figures to flawed statistical method. Every version of this number is contested by someone with a reason to want it different. The range most historians actually work with, 36 million to 45 million, sits well above the death toll of the First World War. None of that counts the tens of millions of births lost or postponed because women across the country were too malnourished to carry a pregnancy to term. By 1962, even the Communist Party couldn't keep pretending. More than 7,000 officials from across the country were summoned to Beijing for what became known as the 7,000 Cadres Conference, one of the largest internal party gatherings in its history. President Liu Shaoqi stood up and delivered the closest thing to an honest public accounting the party would offer for decades. The famine, he told the room, was 30% natural disaster and 70% man-made error. Not everyone in the room was comfortable with how far that honesty went. Premier Zhou Enlai stepped in at points to defend Mao directly. A senior official named Peng Zhen went further than most, arguing openly that Mao himself wasn't beyond criticism. A few years later, during the Cultural Revolution, that position would help get him purged too. Mao performed a self-criticism at the conference and stepped back from day-to-day economic control, handing it to Liu Shaoqi and his deputy, Deng Xiaoping. Nobody was put on trial, and Mao wasn't removed from power. He wasn't even fully sidelined. He stepped back and waited. 4 years later, he launched the Cultural Revolution, in significant part to reclaim the authority he'd lost after the famine. Liu Shaoqi, the man who had stood up in 1962 and told the party the uncomfortable version of the truth, was later purged, denounced as a capitalist rotor, and died in detention under conditions of medical neglect. Peng Zhen was dragged through the same machinery. Decades later, Chinese school textbooks are still unlikely to use the words Great Famine anywhere. The official term, still standard, is the 3 years of natural disasters. Weather, not policy. It's a framing that has had more than 60 years to settle in. In 2014, an article published under the banner of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a top state-run think tank, accused hostile Western forces of inflating the death toll specifically to undermine the party's legitimacy. The piece acknowledged great loss had occurred, while calling the whole episode an exploratory miscarriage on the road to socialism. It set off a wave of pushback on Chinese social media. The official line never moved. Provincial archives that historians had limited access to in the 2000s and early 2010s have since been closed again. They're the same archives Frank Decoder and others used to build their case. In January of 2023, China's total population fell for the first time in more than 60 years. The cause was unrelated to anything covered here. Falling birth rates and an aging population. Nothing to do with famine. Nearly every major outlet that covered the story reached for the same historical footnote anyway. The last time this happened was 1961. The furnace program itself hadn't lasted anywhere near 60 years. By 1960, the backyard furnaces had stopped running. Once even provincial officials couldn't keep insisting the iron coming out of them was usable for anything. The cooking pots that went into them were never replaced. The promise that started all of it, 15 years to catch Britain in steel and compressed by the speeches that followed to 3, ended up costing more lives than the First World War, by even the more conservative counts. Nobody who made that promise faced a trial, a tribunal, or any public reckoning. Mao Zedong remained chairman of the Chinese Communist Party for another 14 years, until his death in 1976.